Should we run 155 mph capable Pendolinos on HS2? The short answer, in my opinion, is no. But what's this all about? It's a proposal by the renowned and well-respected railway veteran Chris Gibb, who proposes that Class 3 90s should be fitted with new traction systems and bogies so they can operate at 155 mph in non-tilt mode on HS2. What's the benefit? Primarily, it's about capacity from Glasgow and Manchester into London. But he has also claimed that the Glasgow to London journey time will be 17 minutes slower via HS2 than the existing service, but I'll get back to that point a little bit later on. Firstly, I do have to agree with the point about capacity. In fact, I was one of the first people to demonstrate that HS2 in its current form, ending at Handsacre, will lead to a reduction in seating capacity from Manchester and Glasgow into London. But it's important to stipulate seating capacity. Why is this the case? Because the HS2 trains currently on order are 200 metres long. The idea being that they would work in multiple from Birmingham Curzon Street, and the new HS2 platforms at Manchester Piccadilly so would be 400 metres long during the peak hours, providing up to 1,100 seats. But with no new HS2 platforms at Manchester, there is no room at Piccadilly for 400 metre long trains. Even if HS2 were to be built in full to Goulburn, Glasgow would still have seen 200 metre long sets, but would have benefited from an increase in frequency, leading to an overall capacity gain. But unfortunately, curtailing HS2 means that no more trains can operate between Glasgow and Euston than already currently do. The main issue is that the 265 metre long 11 car Pendolinos have 589 seats, whereas the proposed HS2 units would have around 500 to 550 seats per 200 metre long set. So there will be an overall reduction in seating capacity on some routes. It is, however, important to point out that the current indicative service pattern, once HS2 opens to Handsacre, still shows at least one so-called classic service would be maintained from Manchester via Milton Keynes to London Euston. So Manchester could see up to 4 trains per hour to London, comprised of 3 HS2 and 1 classic service. So there could still be an overall capacity gain and more choice for passengers. Glasgow is a little bit more tricky, as capacity is limited between Crewe, Warrington and Wigan on the West Coast Main Line. So without HS2 to Goulburn, no more trains can operate than currently do. So technically there will be a reduction in seating capacity from Glasgow, at least for the direct Glasgow to London via HS2 service, which would replace the existing direct service. There is also that 17-minute claim that I will address shortly. Liverpool to London will still see an overall increase, with the service increased to 2 trains per hour with HS2 to Handsacre, even taking into account the proposed additional Avanti service from Liverpool to London. Although Gibb seems to suggest one of the additional services per hour should continue to use the West Coast Main Line, but using the new HS2 trains. This possibly may have some merit, at least until HS2 is completed to Euston. The report also recommends that the existing 2 cross-country services per hour from Manchester are replaced by 2 200 metre long HS2 services from Manchester to Birmingham. This would provide a capacity uplift between Manchester and Birmingham, and Chris claims would reduce the journey from 90 minutes currently to 50 minutes. Although the existing services currently stop at Stockport, Macclesfield, Stoke, Stafford and Wolverhampton, and takes 57 minutes just to get from Manchester to Stafford. So the question has to be, is he suggesting that some stops would be missed out between Manchester and Birmingham? Obviously Wolverhampton wouldn't be stopped at, as the trains would join the HS2 route at Handsacre and call into Birmingham Curzon Street. This would also remove the direct connectivity from Manchester with the south and southwest, with the XC services continuing to Bristol and Bournemouth. Manchester to Birmingham connectivity is one thing I have constantly been going on about, and I feel it has been repeatedly ignored within the HS2 debate. Despite the time savings between the UK's 2 largest regional cities, that would have been transformational, but HS2 would have retained the existing service and supplemented it with the new HS2 services. so the local connectivity between Manchester and Birmingham and the regional connectivity between Manchester and the south would have been retained. As it stands, I don't think we should be replacing the existing service with an HS2 service, not least because the time saving claimed would not be achievable without removing stops between Manchester and Birmingham. The other significant proposal is to de-scope Euston to have just two 400 metre long HS2 platforms, which would be used for the Birmingham services. Beyond that, I'm not really sure what Gibb is suggesting. He makes reference to the Caledonian sleeper platforms, which are 400 metres long already, but with no connection from HS2 to the existing station possible, they seem irrelevant. I'm working on the basis that he means continue to build some new platforms at Euston, but only build two 400 metre long platforms, with new shorter platforms which would be served by Pendolinos. But I can't imagine that building shorter platforms would save a great deal of money, so I'm not sure what the benefit would be. But it's worth reiterating that the current design for Euston Tunnel and the approach would not allow for a connection from HS2 to the existing platforms, simply because of the lack of space available. Why do I oppose this plan? Beyond being a supporter of HS2, I think Richard Bowker put it best during the interview Chris Gibb did with Green Signals. Richard said it could be seen as letting the government off the hook. This was said when Sunak was still in power, and Richard may have been playing devil's advocate, but I still agree with the sentiment. Why should any government continue to develop HS2 if we can just throw some Pendolinos along it and call it a day? Gibb's proposal also means that Birmingham services will be slower and could operate at a maximum of 186 miles per hour instead of between 200 and 225 miles per hour. I know HS2 is primarily about capacity, but it just seems a shame to cut the benefit for Birmingham just so we can operate Class 390s on HS2. Gibb also said during the same interview that he is challenging the industry to see if it's possible to re-engineer Pendolinos, which seems a change from the tone of the report. Perhaps instead we should be challenging the industry to find a cost-effective way to modify the HS2 rolling stock order, and instead order 250 or 260 metre long HS2 sets, which would have more capacity than a Class 390 despite being a similar length. This is because the Class 390s are quite space inefficient when it comes to seating capacity. It doesn't mean that the HS2 sets will just cram the seats in. Think of it more like IET's Class 800s, which for a similar length would have more seats than a Pendolino, but the legroom on most IETs I think is quite good. I'm not saying that we have to modify the order for all of the units, that would be tricky, and obviously with the portion working with 400 metre long sets, we still do need some 200 metre long sets, but a handful of sets for Peak Manchester and Glasgow services would be sufficient. These units could be maintained at existing West Coast mainline depots if the Washwood Heath Maintenance Hall isn't big enough to accommodate longer units. But surely my main argument is that modifying the HS2 rolling stock order would be no more expensive than fitting new traction equipment to 20-year-old trains. I also have to question the 17-minute longer claim between Glasgow and London, to which I still haven't been able to get a satisfactory answer to what this means. It most certainly will not mean that the service from Glasgow to London via HS2 would be 17 minutes slower than today, as even the most pessimistic time penalty for non-tilting trains between Glasgow and Handsacre would be more than made up for with the time saving between Handsacre and London. And plans to lift the non-tilt speed on the West Coast mainline are already well in advance, and a special speed limit can be applied on straighter sections of the West Coast mainline to allow non-tilting multiple units to travel at 125 miles per hour rather than 110 miles per hour currently, which would further reduce the time penalty. In addition, as far as I can tell within the current plan, there is still scope for an additional Lancaster to Euston service. This service would stop at Preston, Wigan and Warrington, then join with a Liverpool HS2 service at Crewe, which means it would only require a single path between Crewe and Handsacre. This could mean that the Glasgow service could make fewer stops on the West Coast mainline, further reducing the overall time. This service would have been introduced only after the completion of HS2 to Crewe, but before the completion of HS2 to Goulburn, so would have operated over the constrained section between Crewe and Wigan. Although I imagine the capacity for this service would have been released by running the Glasgow service non-stop from Preston, but I'm not sure if there'll be scope to run the Lancaster service to or from Glasgow instead. My main point is there are other options, but I think ultimately there is little point running the proposed full HS2 timetable until HS2 is open to Euston, so this does give the government time to reconsider its decision and come up with a better plan than operating Pendolinos at 155 miles per hour on HS2. Trains which will be closer to 30 years old by the time HS2 opens to Handsacre. Until HS2 opens to Euston, it may just be better to operate a limited service from Manchester to Old Oak Common, perhaps 2 HS2 trains per hour to Old Oak, with 2 classic services to Euston. Similarly, Liverpool to London could be 1 HS2 and 1 classic service per hour. Admittedly, this leaves a question about Glasgow to which I don't have a good answer. Perhaps an alternating HS2 and classic service with 260 metre long HS2 trains. Terminating trains at Old Oak Common is far from ideal, and HS2 must be built to Euston, but there will be benefits of changing trains at Old Oak, with connections via Crossrail to central London and Heathrow, and the South West via GWR services. So there would be benefits of providing services from the north to Old Oak Common. I know I'm just one man, and Chris has decades of experience, has the support of many within the rail industry, and should be stated, has my full respect. But myself and others, including industry experts I have spoken to privately, disagree with this proposal, as pragmatic as it may seem on the surface.